Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Hey folks, and welcome to the show. In this episode of the BS Podcast, I have the privilege of talking with Samuel Salzer. His intro and bio is to come, but just as a brief intro to the show, he and I cover lots of ground in our conversation. We talk about the shared mission of behavioral professionals outside academia and how good work is being done by many folks in our industry, regardless of whether they come from a past of formal academic training. We dig into the psychology of habit formation and how products ought to be designed around creating positive habits. We liken these things to smoking and smoking cessation, a fascinating analogy, I think, to understand the goods and services in our lives that hook us in. We discuss the 100 best books in the BS world, and finally, my exit question to Sam, which is probably my favorite for all my guests on each episode, the BBB, or the Big Behavioral Brainstorm. In this case, is a wonderfully insightful response to the question, and it may just be the one hack to fix many of the problems facing humanity today. It may just be the one nudge to rule them all. So I hope you enjoy. And remember to subscribe on Apple iTunes or wherever you're listening to this for new weekly episodes delivered right to your digital doorstep. So without further ado, here is my conversation with the impressive Sam Salzer. Samuel Salzer is an independent behavioral design strategist with a focus on applying behavioral science thinking to habit-forming digital products and services. He's partnered with wildly popular apps and products to encourage good, healthy, sustainable behavior change, some of those including Lifesum and Deedster. Prior to this, Samuel cut his behavioral teeth at Beteendelabbet, sorry for the pronunciation there, which translates into Behavioral Lab. That is Sweden's leading behavioral consultancy. He's an avid speaker and seminar facilitator, giving talks and workshops on topics related to behavioral design and digital behavior change. And this is my own read of having followed Samuel on social media and LinkedIn in particular for the last couple of years. He's genuinely in the game of behavioral insights and behavior design to make the world and to make business a better place, which is something that I think is certainly a commendable pursuit. So, Samuel, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nick. What an introduction. I'm very impressed both by the introduction itself, but also you're Swedish. I think you did a good job.
Okay, good. Check. First one done. That's awesome. Okay, so I like to jump into my interviews or these conversations head first, as opposed to easing my guests in. So apologies up front for that. But I have two opening questions that are really top of mind for me. So these are, I guess, newsworthy, or at least they're newsworthy in my mind because there's something that just happened recently to me and something more at large. So I see them as very much inspiring, being inspired from a psychological or behavioral perspective. And so I'm just curious to get your take on these two questions or things that happened, and to maybe get us into a hypothesis testing frame of mind for the rest of our conversation. So if you're game, I'm going to explain a little bit about what I'm thinking about, and then I'll ask you a question related to that. Sound good?
Awesome. Let's go.
Okay. So first this is something that just happened to me last night, or the night before. So 2 nights ago. So I'm quite active on LinkedIn. It's where I build my behavioral community. A lot of the listeners probably know that. And I love LinkedIn because for a number of reasons, but the main reason is because it allows a professional to build a network of like-minded individuals and to rally around a common pursuit and a cause, like in my case, behavioral science and behavioral insights. So anyways, I post quite frequently various content and snippets and little announcements. And, I don't do it for the likes, people, but I like to see when I've sort of struck a chord with individuals, and I get a few likes here and there, and some commentary that goes back and forth, and I've been doing that for about a year now. 2 nights ago, I just woke up. It was early in the morning, and I read the news that Netflix had included a new feature that allows or will allow the user, the person watching Netflix, to fast forward or to watch a show at 1.5 or 2 times the speed. So similar to what you see in Audible and podcast listening, actually. So now you can watch shows at a faster speed. So anyways, I had a very small commentary about, oh, this is depressing to me. It's also intriguing as a scientist because I'm curious about what people will think, and et cetera, et cetera. So I wrote this post in the early morning, and all of a sudden it went, by all accounts, viral. It's the first time that it's happened to me. And it's now upwards of 100,000 views with.
Whoa! Okay.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. This has never happened to me, and I've been very active on LinkedIn for a couple of years. So that's the scenario, that's the context. And so now my question, fundamentally, and I know you're in the game because of, and we'll talk about this a little later with Habit Weekly, your content curation of behavioral design. So fundamentally, this is about capturing people's attention and creating content, creating a message that is relatable, that is salient in the mind of the person that's on the other end reading this, so that they feel compelled to then share and add in their 2 cents and contribute to that piece of content or that message. So my question is, what do you think it is about this post in particular that was so wildly successful in terms of it going viral, whereas all the other stuff hasn't really been successful in that same regard? What are your thoughts there?
Sure. So I think one thing, obviously, is that was quite timely in how you probably posted it. So it sounds like the news broke, and then you kind of took the lead in making a comment on this new development. And I've noticed LinkedIn is a little bit different. They seem to be working in kind of interesting curating fashion, where they kind of try to piggyback on trends, and then they try to curate that sometimes as well. So you see, for example, that some new kind of thing has broken in the kind of the news cycle, and then to kind of lift the content inside of the platform. So they don't want people to leave the platform. So they want people to stay within the platform, engage with the content in there. So can I ask you, actually, did you have a link on your post, or did you just comment? Like, it was just a comment?
Yeah, good question. I forgot. It was a New York Times piece,
right,
which I linked to.
Right. So that can have, I've noticed that can have, sometimes it can help because it kind of drives the traffic to a similar thing. So in this scenario, I'm guessing what the LinkedIn algorithm did was that it kind of like noticed that a lot of people are linking to this content or this topic. And then it tried to look at, okay, which posts are getting most traction? Okay, these ones, okay, let's give them a boost. Because these, and so they noticed that people found this interesting, and then they looked for, and this is all obviously happening quite automatically. And then they look at, okay, so which ones are getting most traction? Okay, let's boost them even more. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what happened.
That's good. That's I think my intuitions are along the same lines as yours there. And what's really fascinating for me, again, from this from a psychological perspective, is the comments, which is, there's like hundreds of comments now in that original thread, and people, because the one piece I said in my initial commentary was, I'm intrigued from a scientist perspective because this could be used as a predictive variable in a model where somebody who's very much in favor of this new feature of speeding up watching, media and shows and movies, that might actually be predictive of other downstream behaviors or attitudes or emotions versus, say, somebody who's very opposed to that. And so that's what I said, something along those lines. And you, just in reading the comments, it is very split, actually. Some people are very much in favor of the new feature, and other people are not just opposed, but think it's like almost like they've taken on like a moralistic position to say that it's evil or fundamentally bad to have this included for the human species. So it's split, which anytime I see something that is so divisive and so split, the scientists and the psychologist in me says, oh, that there's something interesting there.
That is super interesting. I think it really, what it comes to is something that's very kind of fundamental of our field, in that this kind of interplay between that we design something, we create something, and what we create design us in turn. So I think the word for this is ontological design, in that, for example, we design buildings, we design cities, but then obviously the cities and buildings in return design how we act and how we behave. And then the latest wave of this has obviously been with technology, that our devices that we have created and the apps that they include, that we also designed, are in turn obviously now shaping our behavior and how we interact on a day-to-day basis. And I think this, I can guess that a lot of people were reacting to, like, wait, what is this going to do to our attention span? Or, having this kind of new feature, is that going to make us worse at kind of taking in a movie? Like, can we maybe in the future, people are maybe afraid that, okay, is this going to design our attention span to maybe not be able to watch a full-length film without kind of fast forwarding the boring bits or something? So I'm guessing that's kind of what I think a lot of people are triggered by, that kind of friction between those things.
What was the term you said? Ontological
design. I think it's called ontological design. At least that's the idea of this kind of that what we design us in turn. I might have pronounced that wrongly, but I think that's kind of the idea of we live in this constant interchange with what we design in turn design our behavior.
That's fascinating. And I was actually thinking about this yesterday working with a client. And with them, I'm working on culture, and culture change and cultural transformation has become in the last decade this big new initiative, and is often accompanied with big strategy, change management. And my read of it is that most of the big players out there, most of the big firms, aren't doing culture change right. And there's a number of reasons why I think that's the case. Chief among them being that they're sort of failing to consider behavioral insights. But then I got into reading this literature from the 70s in evolutionary science and anthropology, where they basically say, culture is this weird thing because it's super abstract, it's amorphous, it's intangible, and yet it's so fundamentally important for our day-to-day lives and behaviors. And so now they're saying that we can actually design culture intentionally, that we can be intentional about how we create and how we transform and change culture. And so obviously I'm most interested in that in the context of brands and organizational culture. So if that's the case, if we can design culture, there's going to be at some level to go back to this ontological design premise, there's going to be at some level that we design the culture, then the culture takes off in this emergent sort of way, and then that culture has this recursive effect back on us and our behaviors, and so on and so forth, back through this feedback loop. So it's a fascinating concept. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and I think it's something that I think about a lot in terms of, obviously, whether we talk about it as designing choice architecture or environments in general, both physical environments but digital environments. It's a very interesting, just really thinking about it from this perspective, and that's kind of also what you mentioned before, and that my focus has been for a long time on how can we create better designs and better products and services, to the end of that I hope that me and the future generations will be influenced by things in a positive way, obviously. And so I think that's why I spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, how can I make sure that the things I design will have this positive spiral of designing positive behaviors and leading to more positive designs in the future and so on. So yeah.
And that's actually a great segue to the second, which is perhaps a more meaty question.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the initial one took us 11 minutes. So this might take us into like 3-4 hours. So we'll see. This notion of building and designing physical spaces and products and services, and also digital ones, to then create a domino effect of a virtuous cycle, so that it's good, however we define good, it's positive, it's sustainable. It seems to me that a lot of the early big giants in this space, the tech giants, the Twitters and the Facebooks and the other social medias, that wasn't on their mind when they were initially setting out to design their products. And I don't think they were doing it, and this has come up in previous conversations with guests, I don't think they were doing it because they're malevolent and evil and sinister beings. I think they sort of just missed the point there. And now they're coming back after the fact to sort of post hoc redesign certain elements and certain features of their products that make them better, and to feed into this behavior change for good. So to this point, just a few days ago, I read that Twitter had announced that they would be removing all political ads from their platform. And now Zuckerberg was recently in front of the Congress, U.S. Congress. And so there's a lot of push from the public for Zuckerberg and Facebook to do the same, to remove political ads. So in my mind, this is the quintessential changing behavior through demographic targeted ads, which the Cambridge Analytica stuff. There's some serious implications there. So this is a real thing, and it's on the side of, it's a little bit outside my wheelhouse and probably outside yours as well. But I'm just curious to get your insights. Do you think we need more behavioral experts in these big tech companies, so that we can think about how can we change behavior for good at the onset, at the very beginning, as opposed to sort of going back and doing some reparations after the fact that things go wrong?
Right. And so you're asking in terms of, do we need to put more behavioral scientists into Facebook, or are you meaning more kind of the new Facebooks of the world that's going to kind of grow? Do we need from the beginning to have more behavioral focus?
Yeah, maybe both.
Okay, maybe both.
Maybe both. Yeah, that's good. That's good distinction. But I'm curious to know both.
Well, I think the problem with Facebook is, like you kind of allude to, is quite complex in that it's, to be honest, I think a lot of people have mentioned this, it's pretty clear by this point that the idea of Facebook, okay, it is to connect people, but that's a mean to an end. It's a means to get ad revenues. And so that's kind of fundamental of their business model, to get people's attention for a longer time so that they can supply them with ads. And so I guess that's a little bit of a tricky thing. And I think for me, I actually commented on something on this earlier this week in regards, I think a new feature on Facebook reminded people to do some form of health checks or something. And then if we kind of celebrate because, oh, look, Facebook are kind of like promoting healthy behaviors. And so how I see it is that obviously that's a good thing, but I wish that Facebook would focus more time on the core function that they're trying to do, which is create better relationships. And so if really they cared about the users, I would love to have more people, both, I guess, behavioral science people and psychologists and so on, really thinking about, okay, the goal of Facebook is to strengthening connections and relationships. How is our current platform doing that, and how can we improve that? And so I think there are obviously a lot of good conversation in this space, and especially with time well spent and so on, these kind of movements. And I think it's starting to raise this question of, okay, we can do a lot of things with the mediums and the platforms that we have. And that's why it's a little bit unfortunate that doesn't seem to be still a focus for the likes of Facebook today, where I don't really see any like really big pushes for how can we make sure that the interactions on our platform is of high quality. And it's funny you talk about this as well in terms of, in general, in terms of what is good behavioral design, because I'm reminded of this really interesting study that was done with, I think, called Moment, which is a health mental, I think it's like digital health app, I think they branded that, and then pretty much tracks your usage of your phone and how you interact with it. And what they did was that they kind of measured kind of the time people spent in different platforms and different mediums. And then they kind of give it back to the user, that information, and they could rate the time they spent on that platform, whether that was like time well spent or if they regretted having spent that much time on that platform. And what we could see there, which is really interesting, is that if you look on platforms like Instagram, Facebook, and I think Snapchat was the worst. I think they had 40% time well spent. And so that's pretty terrible. Like if your users are spending time in your platform and then regretting 60% of the time, is a really big kind of big part that feels to be wasted by the user. But what's interesting in terms of Facebook is that if you looked at Facebook by itself, it had 40% of time spent. But if you looked at the kind of a messenger app, people said about 85 or 90% time was spent. And I think the highest one in this study was FaceTime and kind of the phone and messaging app on the iPhone. And so, and they were approaching, like FaceTime, I think was high, was like 90, 95% or something. And it makes sense because, if I speak to someone on FaceTime, I usually speak to my friends, my family, or someone I care about. So it's a meaningful interaction.
The things closer to actual human contact.
Exactly. But if I'm spending time on the Facebook app, most of the time, probably what I would do is like scroll through the newsfeed, right? Or, I wouldn't really do anything that really makes me feel more closer really to my friends and family or close ones. So I think that's a whole different discussion. Maybe we shouldn't talk about that for much longer, but I think that's a really important thing to just highlight. Going back to kind of your main question, I think it's an interesting trend where I see some startups that have from the get-go had some form of co-founder that's been kind of a behavioral scientist or psychologist. Mm-hmm. And I definitely see that as kind of somewhat of a unique selling point at this time. I think depending obviously the problem you're trying to solve, it's going to be more or less relevant. But there's some, okay, so this might be my super biased opinion, being in this field. But obviously, if I would look at kind of being an entrepreneur, from the pure definition of what I'm trying to do as an entrepreneur is that I look at the world in one way, and I have a vision for how the world can look differently. And I want to make the world to kind of transform into my vision. So I want to create something that's going to like make people change how they live their lives or how the world look like. And so per definition, obviously you want to change behaviors. And so like looking at from that point of view, it's always going to be interesting to see, okay, how is this product, service, or idea going to try to change behaviors? And having a behavioral scientist or having some form of someone with a behavioral design kind of thinking is always going to give a little more nuanced understanding of maybe what we have in front of us, what's kind of the task at hand. And so yeah, I think what I'm seeing more and more is that either you have a founding partner that's kind of a behavioral something, either you have an advisor that's a behavioral something, or you quite quickly as you grow, you start bringing that in because it's going to be important.
Mm-hmm. I've actually had this conversation a number of times with friends and colleagues mm-hmm. and clients. Is that it used to be the case that if you were an entrepreneur, and let's say that entrepreneur, that founder, didn't have a tech background, but they were, they had the chops of being a creator and an entrepreneur, and they're building some product, let's say a tech product. They would go to seek out external funding through VCs, and any potential interested VC would come back and tell them, yeah, I'm interested. It's great. However, you need a co-founder, and specifically you need a CTO. You need a tech co-founder. So I've always, and I understand why that's the case, obviously, with tech products. Sure. I wonder now if, and again, this is my bias, and the bias which we share is, I wonder if we should elevate to that same level, making sure that we include the CBO or the Chief Behavioral Officer. And if it's not in that original founding team, at least having somebody in the early team certainly, if not that, then certainly as an advisor, as you say. So at some point in that early stage, especially if the product or the thing itself is involving human behavior or human emotions, which, I mean, you could argue that basically everything involves that at some level. It's perfectly sensible in my mind to have somebody with that expertise early on.
Yeah, and I think it depends a little bit on the startup and the kind of problem they're tackling. And I've actually had cases where I have kind of said that, well, they wanted to bring me in as more of a kind of a consultant and do consulting work. But I said that, well, actually, you guys don't really need that much kind of consulting work from the behavioral side right now, but I'll be an advisor and kind of guide you with the kind of the smaller parts that might be important to you right now. So I think it does depend a little bit. I think it's such a tricky thing when you start a business, in that, you know, there's so many things that obviously you want to have capabilities and knowledge in, and it's very hard to kind of strategize where to most effectively kind of or efficiently put the limited funds that you've bootstrapped and so on. So I think, yeah, I want to say that yes, always bring in something straight from the beginning. But I would say, like, as a caution, I would say, like, well, it's going to be important to have that guidance always. But I think depending on when you bring that in as a form, like either an employee or getting some form of consulting work, for example, it's going to depend on the solution or the service that you're working on.
Yeah, I agree, totally. And you know, hopefully there's more behavioral design, behavioral science, behavioral insights people who are those original founders, and they just sort of take care of it, because they're going to just, you know, by default include those things in whatever it is they're creating. And back to your previous point, that study, which is fascinating. So there's this clear mismatch between engagement, and I don't even want to use that word, but let's use that word. So the engagement versus the enjoyment factor. So with Facebook, or I think you said Snapchat was the worst at, what was it, 60% said they weren't enjoying their time.
Yeah, something like that.
So
I think actually
reminds...
Instagram as well was probably I think they were like 37% or something, 38. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And I'll find that. We can link to it in the show notes.
Great.
What that reminds me of is, and this is your wheelhouse, is habit building and habit formation. So habits aren't inherently good, and they're neither are they inherently good nor bad. It's interesting. It's curious that a few decades ago, or say 2 decades ago, 15, 20 years ago, when you said the word habit, it actually inspired a more negative connotation, because people thought about negative habits, bad habits, smoking, overeating, drinking, etc. And there was this inflection point. There was this change, probably with you know the influx of tech products about 5-10 years ago, where habit now has much more of a positive connotation. And you see that, I mean, just in your own work. And then if you go to the landing page of your website, it's you know, and your newsletter is all about habit. And I too have sort of jumped to the other side to see habits as a good thing. But again, they can be good. They can certainly be bad. So I see the engagement versus enjoyment mismatch on these certain products and platforms as a bad habit. So for instance, and I'm just curious to get your take on this. Is it analogous to, say, smoking, where somebody who is smoking like a lot, like a pack a day, that's going to be really high on the engagement metric. But if you actually ask them after, like, how much did you enjoy that? They're probably going to say, well, not a whole lot. And that's obviously like the addictive properties of nicotine and similar other substances. But I see that as an analogous example there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, if you also consider, for example, with smoking, one of the kind of more new forms of treatment is acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT. And with that, obviously, part of what they're doing is that smokers, they're forced to kind of really focus on the sensations of smoking and the tastes and all this kind of stuff. And I think Judd Brewer, I think his name is one of the leading people in doing that work. And it's quite fascinating to hear him talking about how, people are smoking for 20, 30 years haven't really thought about the taste or the experience of smoking. They've just kind of done it because obviously it produces some positive effects in terms of the stimulants and so on. But they haven't really thought about the real taste and experiments. And when they left to do some form of these exercises, they quickly feel like, wow, this is disgusting. This is a horrible taste. And so I think maybe it's a little bit analogous in that regard. And I think it's done, a lot of these things are done not so consciously. They're done without really thinking about whether they are kind of tasty or enjoyable or whatever you would say. And so yeah, I think there's some similarities for sure. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm curious with the emphasis that you put in your work on habits and habit building, habit formation. What was it that led you there? There's a couple popular books that have come out, and actually very recently, the leading academic researcher, psychologist Wendy Wood, has published her book on habits. So it's a fascinating topic, and I'm just curious how you see it as playing a part in behavior change, and in particular in digital behavior change.
Sure, and just a quick shout out, because I think, thanks for bringing that up in terms of Wendy Wood and her book Good Habits, Bad Habits, because it's really nice to see researchers publishing books as well, because in the habit space there's been obviously great good books, but they've come more from people that have been good at popularizing some of the concepts rather than the real people that have kind of done a lot of their work. And so it's really good to see Wendy come out with their book, and so that's something I also want to really encourage people to check out.
If you don't mind, I want to hold you there for a second, and I promise we'll get back to my initial question. Sure. I'm curious because it is, initially it was the journalists or the thinkers, the creators who were drawing insights from the research themselves. They weren't researchers, but then they were drawing the insights from the research and writing these wonderful books that in the last 10, 15 years have really been the foundation of our field to help explain the rise of the behavioral revolution. And now we're starting to see the researchers themselves write their books. And my intuition is you read one book from the journalist, let's call them, and then you read another book from the researcher, and they do have a different take. They have a different feel. So I'm curious if you think one is more, I'm hesitant to say better, but in terms of it striking a chord with the mass public, do you think there's one that is better if it's coming from the journalist who's drawing on research versus the researcher who's drawing on their own research?
Great question. I've actually thought about this a lot, this thing, because I don't remember if that was in the introduction, but I've been co-authoring a book that's coming out now in here in Sweden on kind of behavioral science and nudging and so on. Okay. And so I was kind of, in doing this, I obviously thought about what is a great book in this space. And obviously, if you look at these different types of books, you mentioned that they're a little bit different in how they're kind of put together. And one of the main differences that in the ones that are written by more kind of journalists and so on, you will have 90% stories, like storytelling examples. And so they usually are very, very light on kind of talking about more, call it, let's say more like real research, or we're talking about the more like nuanced parts of the research, and they're focusing more on just like explaining some form of basic concept through a long story or an example. So they take like all of these inspiring real life stories and then connect them to kind of the topic at hand.
And then sprinkle in the science.
And sprinkle in the science. Yeah. And so that's that type. And then you have obviously the one you mentioned as well, where I think in our field, probably Thinking Fast and Slow was probably one of like the first ones, or maybe Predictably Rational as well, was kind of like really best-selling books in this regard. Like we have, two people that are very experienced in the field, and they write about their kind of research and so on. And I think what's interesting, as thinking about this, I think it's interesting with Thinking Fast and Slow, in that I'm not sure if this is something true, but I heard something about that it was kind of some form of data analysis on kind of Amazon, where they could see in terms of books that were purchased and how many that were finished. And I think Thinking Fast and Slow was one of those books that were kind of highlighted as having a ratio of a lot of people beginning to read the book but never being able to finish it. And I think whether that's true or not, that's okay. But I can also, from my own life, it's one of those books that a lot of people have told me that, I really, once I was able to finish it after 6 months, I really loved it. But it took me a lot of work to get through. And so I think it is a fine balance there, where you obviously want to supply people with something that is really solid in terms of the science side of things. But then you also want to make it easily digestible and interesting. And so yeah, I think it's a fine balance. I think for me, I've also seen both of those in my kind of journey to where I am now, where I remember really appreciating kind of the Gladwell books when I first got started. But now it's not really my thing anymore because it doesn't really give me.
Is that because because Gladwell doesn't go into enough of, he's more sort of light on the actual nuance of the findings and the studies, and more and overemphasizes the storytelling part?
Yeah, and it's just a little bit harder to trust in that. Okay, what I'm reading, is this actually reflecting on real life? Is this something that just sounds good and it makes for a good story, or is it something that really makes me understand the world better? And I think it definitely inspires you to want to understand the world better, but as a factual kind of collection of of research, I'm not sure if it does. So I think that's kind of where maybe my preference has changed a little bit. But I think, saying that again, I think for someone who has no knowledge of behavioral science, for example, if they pick up a Gladwell book, that could be very well be kind of the triggering, or the kind of the first
the gateway drug.
Yeah. And then maybe so that's kind of what I recommend, and that's kind of what I also tell people. And when people ask me for book recommendation, I often kind of trying to gauge where their level of knowledge is currently. And so I might tell some people Predictably Rational, and then others people Thinking Fast and Slow, and so on, depending on where they are in their kind of the level of
behavioral journey. Yeah. I see the chain of book reading start, like, I think you've laid it out perfectly. I think it starts with a Malcolm Gladwell or type of, and I mean, he's just such a prolific and engaging
it's amazing
writer, and then that whets the reader's appetite, that piques their interest, and then I think they do a little bit more of a deep dive in. It's when they get to Dan's and Predictably Irrational and Thaler and Sunstein's Nudge, and then if they really get into it, they're going to go to Kahneman's work and the other ones that have come out. That's sort of those books, and Bob Cialdini, and the more on the academics and the researchers. And it's amazing that there's a lot of people I've talked to who've been in their industry. They're well established veterans in their industry. Insurance or financial services or whatever it is, and they just so happy, they typically are really intelligent, really motivated, voracious readers, and they say, and I've heard this many times, 10 years ago I picked up this book, it's Predictably Irrational or Nudge, and my world was changed. And then now they're in a place, seasoned veterans, well established in their own industry. And I've heard stories where they are now bringing behavioral insights internally into their firms and into their organizations because of these books, which I think is just so fascinating. And I think it says, like, it speaks to the power of communicating this stuff, this science and the insights. And so I'm very happy to hear that you're writing your own, because I think we need more of that. And I think it needs to be, I don't think there's a perfect template that we need to work for. I think some of the books are going to be heavy on storytelling because that's going to speak to some people. I think some of the other books are going to be heavy on the science because, and so on and so forth. And while others, I think the third category would be those that are more like, playbooks that are heavy on the application of the to-do. This is how you do behavioral science in the wild. This is how you do behavioral design for different clients. I think those are the three different categories, and I think we need all three types to round us out and to keep us relevant in the minds of people, so that 10, 20 years from now, we continue to have people inspired by behavioral science and behavioral design.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I actually recently created this kind of guide of 100 books to become a behavioral designer, was kind of the idea of it, at least. And putting that together, I actually found it quite hard to decide to only include these 100 books from our field. Because
did you rank
No.
them? I remember seeing that come out. Did you rank them? I can't remember. Okay, because that would have made it even much
No,
harder.
that would be
a lot of
heartbreaking.
people probably pissed off at you.
Yeah. But what I did is that I actually structured it in 4 phases. And so the first phase was pretty much trying to understand the foundational, it was 10 books on kind of helping people understand the foundational kind of insights into, for example, how we make decisions and how we kind of more on a general level of how we act in the world. And then the second level or the second group of books was about the tools, like the tools we have in terms of changing behavior and understanding users or people. And then the third level was kind of processes. So how can we implement this? And so in each of these levels, you have a lot of amazing books, and that's quite amazing to see today, where it's actually possible to have those distinctions and be able to supply people with books depending on kind of what they're looking at. And if they have a really solid foundation of understanding kind of human behavior, that they can then go to, for example, books like another great book is by Stephen Wandel in terms of, I think it's called Designing for Behavior Change, which really just look at from a really like practitioner point of view, of how can we design, let's say, digital products or something from a behavioral science point of view. And then the fourth one was just like the grouping of 70 books where I couldn't really, there was so many great books. I just kind of had them as kind of, these are also 70 great books if you want to deep dive in whatever you find interesting. So if you're interested in the the neuro stuff, or if you're interested in more of the kind of maybe evolutionary psychology stuff, depending on where your kind of interest lies and where you want to create your niche, you can deep dive there. So that's kind of was my approach to tackling these different types of books as well.
And that's a fantastic resource for anyone who's interested in the space, or who's been in the space for some time. Like, I have definitely not read, I don't even want to say percentage of those. So I will absolutely be linking to that. What is your favorite in that list?
Putting me on the spot. Wow.
I am. You can give me maybe 2 or 3 if that makes it easier for you.
Well, so one I would like to give credit to, because you mentioned it as well, is influence. I think in terms of what we mentioned before, Bob did a really great job in creating something that is both kind of transcending some form of research, but in a very easily digestible way and very entertaining. I think a lot of people have read Influence, and also one of the slightly older ones in relative terms, and it still stood the test of time, so to say. So I think that's one of the.
I find with that one too, especially that it resonates. Obviously, given the subject matter, is it really resonates with marketing folks and sales folks, where I don't see them picking up nudge as much. That's more sort of like policy. The new recent ones that you mentioned there, also Matt Wallert's new one, like those are definitely for like the product people. So depending on the business function, the business unit, there's going to be a book under the umbrella behavioral insights that's more relevant for that use case or that business case.
Okay, can I say three books that I've really enjoyed? That's little bit under the
Yeah.
radar, so it might be interesting for people as well. And so I put them all actually in the first level because they're all kind of looking at the kind of more foundational stuff in terms of how we behave. And so the first one is Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me. And that's a really interesting book in terms of cognitive dissonance and how we deal with cognitive dissonance in our lives. So Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me.
Who's the author on that?
So it's Travis Elliott. I might butcher it. So maybe you can link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll definitely link that. Yeah, I'm just making notes.
Sure. Then you have a book, Spent by Joffrey Miller. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting book because it tries to do a lot of things where I read it and it definitely made me think about the world differently in terms of it combines evolutionary psychology with kind of consumer psychology. And so even though I don't really work too much in retail and so on, and also it obviously invokes a lot of parts of personality theory. So Big Five is a big part of this book as well. And so it has those kind of elements which mixed and put in that context makes for a really interesting read. And then lastly, talking about mixing a lot of things, Behave by Robert Sapolsky is probably my favorite book. If I were to choose one, I think that's probably one of my favorites because it's what it really does is that it shows the complexity of behavior. Because he's in the book is trying to show that, okay, what does it take to make a behavior happen? And he looks at from like these 7 different disciplines. So everything from more of the more kind of behaviorist point of view to the more biological and evolutionary and so on. And so you get a very humbling experience of understanding, okay, well, we're dealing with some complex things here, both in terms of that we're very complex beings, but also operate in very complex contexts and environments. So that's a great book as well.
He's a fascinating academic, and he's more on, my understanding is like more of like the neurobiological and the neurologist side of things, but he's able to weave in all elements of behavior, brain, and psychological functioning. So I'm really glad you mentioned that one. Well, that is a great, so I will definitely be linking to those. Couple more questions here, and honestly, I could go on forever, but I'm going to be mindful of your time. So
should I tell you about how I started, by the way, or?
Yes, that was actually going to be my question. Go ahead. Yeah. So how did you get into this? Because you don't have the well, one, it's a bit of a mystery. I typically know exactly how people get to where they are in this field. So you're a bit of a mystery there. So I'm very curious to know a little more. And because you don't, from what I gather, it's not the traditional path of behavioral science, behavioral insights. So yes, very curious to hear how you got into the work you're doing now.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely think, I don't know, maybe today we have a traditional path, but it hasn't really existed that long as well. So I think part of the reason for me that I took the path that I did was that when I got started, there wasn't really too much of a traditional path to follow to a certain degree. So what it started for me with was that I was studying at the Australian School of Business in Sydney at UNSW. And I was research assistant for a professor who began to smuggle me books on behavioral economics. and that really, I think, opened my eyes to use this fascinating perspective of human decision making. That I think for me, I had kind of this 2-stage journey with behavioral economics, where first it really was a stage of enlightenment where I felt like, wow, this is such an amazing way to look at the world, which gives it much more nuance and so on. And so that really got me hooked.
What were you studying? Sorry to interrupt. What were you studying?
So I was studying a mix of economics, finance, and accounting. And so my major in the end was finance and accounting. So for me, this happened a little bit after I chosen my major. And so I pretty much, by that point, started to realize that I had kind of, we're approaching the wrong way, where my heart was beginning to take me in some ways. And so that's kind of where the shift began for me. And so after that point, I guess I really had this maybe second stage of, once I learned much more about behavioral economics, I had a little bit of a stage of, call it like, disillusionment, where I felt that, well, looking at it as a tool, I feel like I've been given a hammer now in terms of changing behavior. But looking at the landscape of behavior change, I saw things that were not only nails. I saw screws and bolts and whatnot. And I was curious to see how you can look at it from different perspectives than just from behavioral economics. And so that really brought me to, I guess, where I am today, from going into a lot of research on habit formation and more traditional kind of behavioral science and psychology, and trying to bridge the gap of creating more nuanced understanding. And so, again, for me, once I graduated, I didn't really know what path to take. I was looking for jobs that was kind of going to allow me to work with applying behavioral insights in Australia, but I couldn't really find any jobs at the time. And I was looking to possibly doing some more studies. But where it was kind of happening was at Harvard and at Stanford and Chicago. And it just was kind of not realistic at the time to get to those places. And so it was kind of a forced thing, really, where I had to, like, okay, well, I'm very passionate about this. I want to know everything I can about this. Can I make that possible somehow without going to, let's say, Harvard? And so I think what has kind of got me to this point today is a combination of being very humble and trying to really look at the kind of the source material, reading a lot of research papers and a lot of the kind of, not only the books, but also kind of the foundational research papers, testing that obviously in practice, but also learning from people that are very experienced as well. And then just having a healthy sense of imposter syndrome along the way, where I've kind of always felt like I need to prove, since I don't have, let's say, a certificate from Harvard or a degree from Harvard or Stanford to say that I have a PhD, for example, I couldn't really lean back on something like that. So I feel like I've had this need to really prove that I know what I'm talking about, and that kind of showing through my work that, okay, it's clear that this is something I know a lot about, pretty much.
Well, I commend you for the path that you've taken and that you are taking. And when I said in my initial question that it's like sort of the non-traditional, I think I misspoke. I think I said that because it wasn't the path that I took. And I, in talking to folks like you and Matt and others who are coming on the show, I think it's a commendable approach, because I think that more and more I'm convinced of the fact that you don't need the PhD, you don't need the credentials. Those serve just as a sort of proxy to be like, yeah, the person knows a lot, they're reasonably intelligent, they're motivated. You can be those things without having a PhD, of course. I think the one thing is that the PhD allows the person to steep themselves within a culture of research and science, as was my background. But you can do that in other ways without getting, the credentials, or without going to the Harvards or the Ivy League school. I think that's just one path, and it's actually an encouraging story, because like my students will often come to me and they're in fourth year, they're at the end of their undergraduate career, and they're absolutely freaking out and panicking because they don't know what to do next. And I tell them, you are actually graduating with a major in behavioral science or neuroscience or psychology, what have you, at the best time possible. You can get you can start your career, or you can land that first job doing the stuff you love, applying the work of psychological science and behavioral science in the real world. Whereas when I graduated, there was no way. There was absolutely no way. And in fact, it was seen as a lot. If you were an undergraduate in psychology, without considering or entertaining the notion of following it up with a postgraduate degree, then you were wasting your money and your time. At least that was the impression that a lot of people had. And it's so different now. And it's because of people like you who are choosing to become the experts right out of undergrad, and being self-taught. I think that's the way forward. To my PhD people out there, like, I think that's also important, and we add a piece to the puzzle that is value add. And I think it's the two sides that are really complementary, that are going to do wonders for our field. So thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah,
it's I commend it.
And I just want to make something.
So my last
question. Make something clear as well.
Go ahead. Of course.
In terms of that, is that it's still so crucial to have somewhat of a understanding of what you also learn through, let's say, a postgraduate degree, which is experimental design, for example, or more knowledge in terms of perhaps doing more statistical analysis or those kind of things as well. I think it's an important thing to consider. Let's say you're someone who's coming more from industry, or maybe doesn't have as much of experience from the academic side of things. It's still super important to realize that, and I think it's really important to just highlight within our field, is that it's not going to matter too much if you know the fancy stuff in terms of the the techniques and theories, if you don't know how to test them and experiment and know what works. So I just want to really make that as a really kind of important component as well, was that obviously I took a little bit different route, but it's still some stuff that you can't really jump kind of and not do. And so I think that's really important, to just be really critical in terms of, okay, if I want to work with behavior change, it's going to be important for me to understand how to do experiments and test and validate them and so on as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for making me feel good about myself for spending years and years and years in school.
Yeah.
And my last question for you is I ask all guests, the BBB, the big behavioral brainstorm. So of all the problems that we humans are facing now, and there seems to be more than ever before, where do you see behavioral insights playing a big part, and what problem could be addressed using behavioral design, behavioral insights, behavioral science?
First of all, let me say that's such a good question that I would love to be raised on a weekly basis. And so I'm happy that your podcast is doing this. So for me, I would say what's really kind of been obsessive for me in general is this intention action gap. And so we didn't get too much into thinking about what is behavioral design for good and so on, for example. But one of the things that I'm interested in looking at, okay, where does some form of intention exist? Because I've been very frustrated seeing a lot of good intentions goes to waste. So a lot of people that have good intentions not being given the tools or the support to translate it into some form of sustained action or sustained behavior. And so for me, I think that's really where I think the field can do, already doing a lot of good work, but can do even more good work in terms of really thinking about where does this gap exist, and how can we, through our work, bridge that gap. And I think we have come some way to doing that, but I think we're still very in early stages of really understanding how we can bridge that gap in more complex settings. We can, obviously we've shown that we can nudge people to do certain things, and we can create some cool behavior change in certain settings, but still a lot of the more call it the really big behavioral problems that we have in the world in terms of sustainable problems or health problems and so on, it's still very much of a problem left to be solved. And so I think that's obviously where I'm dedicating a lot of my time in terms of looking at how can we use the latest in emerging technology, combine that with behavioral science to solve problems in both the health side of things, but also the social impact side of things. So that's my.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great, and it's this. It keeps coming up again because I think this intention action gap, which I think it should be renamed to intention action crater or chasm, because it really isn't just a mere gap. It is massive, and it does explain so much of human behavior, in particular the behaviors that are problematic, that people struggle with. And what I like to see is, and this is your involvement, we didn't get to this, which we'll have to have you back on to discuss, so your involvement with Lifesum and these other digital products and apps, which can be categorized into this grouping of, what some people are calling self-control products, which really address this through emerging technologies, through behavioral science. They address this intention action gap, knowing well and good that our self-control stinks, that we can have the best of intentions, but when it actually comes to carry it out through action and through behavior, we are sorely lacking, and that's not our fault. That's just by design, by evolutionary design. And so I'm really glad to hear that you mentioned that. And so we're at a time, and I want to be mindful of your time, but there's so much more that I had on my sheet here to talk to you about, and so much more came up in our conversation. And just as a primer, because like I said, I'm gonna have to have you back on. My specialty in my PhD and the work that I'm doing now for clients is a lot around ritual, ritual and culture, and your focus is on habit. And so I get into a lot of conversations and sometimes debates and maybe sometimes heated arguments with folks on the difference between habit and ritual. And so I think we're going to have to, in our second conversation, in our second round, start off with that question. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
All right. Well, Sam, thank you so much. This is going to be really useful. A lot of value for listeners. And where can folks find you if they're interested to learn more?
Sure. So I think my website is one place. So samuelsalzer.com. You mentioned as well my newsletter, and so I have a newsletter for people that are interested in behavioral design. And it's pretty much a way for me to kind of give back to the community. So I read a lot of research and content on a weekly basis. And so what I try to do is to combine the best content into one kind of easy, digestible email once a week. And so that's a great thing that I would recommend. And what I want to say in terms of that as well is that thanks to you as well for taking this initiative and doing this podcast, because it's amazing already that we're starting to see more and more good content being created in the field, but there needs to be more. And so this is definitely a really good initiative, and I really look forward to follow it. And you've already had some great guests that I really enjoyed the episode. So kudos to you for taking this initiative as well.
Yes, of course. And with your Habit Weekly, and you are this master curator of all things behavioral, partnered with the podcast. I think we're gonna take over the world, but it's in a good way, right? Because it seems like us behavioral folks we're a pro-social bunch. We're a good bunch. I'm gonna have to have at least one guest in the next little while who's more of the sinister negative type, just to balance it out. But anyways, it seems we're all a good bunch, which is great. Okay, thanks, Sam. It's been fun, and we'll talk soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. Thanks.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.